Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Library. My name is Elaine Didier, and it's my honor to serve as director of the library here in Ann Arbor and also the museum in Grand Rapids. Tonight is a very special evening, partly because all of you are here, partly because the Tigers are playing the Yankees tonight, and also because it's our 30th anniversary. We hope you enjoyed the video show we put together. It's amazing that 3 of those staff featured in the pictures have been here the full 30 years. Dave Horrocks brought the papers from Washington. We literally have pictures of him overseeing the loading of the pallets into the semi-trucks. Bill McNitt was working with the congressional papers next door at the Bentley Library, and Ken Hafele, our lead audiovisual archivist, was an early hire as well. So we have some wonderful corporate memory here, and the staff have really done a wonderful job. We had another member of the Ford administration here just a week ago, Charles Leppert, and he was overwhelmed to see the way we had organized not just his papers, but others from the administration. So we love what we do, and we hope it shows in our services. Tonight's program is brought to you courtesy of the Ford Presidential Foundation. If you're not already a member and a supporter of the Ford Foundation, we hope you will consider doing so. We have information cards and envelopes out in the lobby. That's the way we're able to bring this quality of programming to you here in Ann Arbor and also the museum in Grand Rapids. Tonight, Joe Calvaruso, the executive director of the foundation, is with us. Joe, would you please stand? Thank you. Tonight's program is being taped for later broadcast, and so I'd ask your cooperation on 2 points. 1, please make sure your cell phones are turned off. And secondly, we have passed out cards on every chair. If you have questions during the course of the program, please feel to jot those down. If you need a pencil or writing implement, staff have those available. And you can pass your questions during the program to each side of the auditorium here, and the same in our overflow areas. And those will be collected and brought to me, and after Ms. Mitchell finishes speaking, I'll go to the junior level podium here, and then we'll ask as many as she will have time to handle. So we'd ask your cooperation on that. Now to our program. It is a great pleasure for us to have Susan Ford Bales with us this evening. She's the daughter of President and Mrs. Ford. Susan is known as a highly articulate spokesperson on issues related to breast cancer, and you should know that with her mother, she helped establish October this month as National Breast Cancer Awareness Month, making a real difference in the lives of many thousands of women across the country. Susan has also been extremely active with the Betty Ford Center and its programs to address addiction, and she served as chairman of the board for 5 years. Susan also has a very special and unusual role as the official ship sponsor of the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier CVN 78 that is under construction. The new Ford-class carrier will be christened in 2013 and commissioned in 2015. How many people do you know who are ship sponsors? We think that's wonderful. Susan is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Ford Presidential Foundation and serves as co-chair of the Foundation's Program Committee. She is an avid supporter of all we do at the library and museum, and I have to credit Susan and thank her for playing the key role in inviting and encouraging and making it possible for Andrea Mitchell to be with us this evening. Along with her brother Steve, Susan has also stepped forward to represent the Ford family at many events in Grand Rapids and around the country, giving very generously of her time and talent. We're honored to have her at the library this evening, and I ask you to give her a warm Ann Arbor welcome to Susan Ford.
Thank you, Elaine. I'm really glad to see we have a full house tonight. This is great. Trustees of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, Joe Calvaruso, Dave Horrocks, and members of the staff of Dad's Presidential Library, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Dad's Foundation, welcome to this evening's program. Last week, I was at the museum in Grand Rapids and introduced a special guest, Justice John Paul Stevens. And I'm particularly delighted tonight to be asked to introduce another very special guest. I thought about a lot what I would say and describe the special place that Andrea has in the hearts of Mom and Dad and continues to have with each of us in the Ford family. Time and time again, my thoughts kept coming back to several very vivid images of Andrea. The first is of Andrea and her husband Alan with Mother and Dad in the living room in their house in Beaver Creek, which we were just talking about. As you can imagine, during their many, many Beaver Creek stays with my parents, discussions among the four of them were lively, and I mean very lively. The topic, no matter what, whether during the day or evening, there's one image that never changed. It's an image I've always remembered and hold dear, the ever-present beaming smiles of Mother and Dad whenever they were with Andrea and Alan. Andrea, the joy and happiness that you brought to Mother and Dad are gifts for which they simply are not adequate words to describe. Thank you. Yours is a friendship that is always treasured, and yours is a friendship we will always remember, always. The second image is a very recent one, very, very recent. As all of you know, less than 3 months ago, my mother's national funeral service was conducted in Palm Desert, California. It was a time to celebrate the magnificent life that she had, but it also was a time to say goodbye. Gathered that day at St. Margaret's were hundreds of friends, dignitaries, current and former First Families, former First Family members, President Bush 43, and other mourners all gathered that afternoon to honor my mother. At the end of the service, amidst a sea of tears, I began the long walk out of the center aisle of St. Margaret's Church. And during that walk, I looked up and saw a warm and very comforting smile. And it was a smile that assured me that everything would be all right. It was a smile of someone who, despite her notoriety, was there to mourn very privately and very quietly. She was there with no fanfare, no pretension, no desire other than to honor and say goodbye to her dear friend. And during that final walk out of St. Margaret's, I saw a smile of true friendship, and I saw Andrea. Andrea, your presence and grace that day speaks volumes of your love for Mother and Dad, and the corresponding love that Mother and Dad had for you, for showing all of us the meaning of true friendship, and for all you meant to both of them, including the presence of you being here tonight. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a personal honor and joy to introduce an esteemed journalist, a courageous breast cancer survivor, and I'm very proud to say a dear friend to Mother, Dad, and me, Andrea Mitchell.
Susan, I am so touched to be here and to have such a personal and kind introduction. And to all of you, because this really is the home and the center of all that was and is so wonderful about Gerald R. Ford and Betty Ford. So when Susan invited me, it was an honor that I accepted gratefully and humbly. After all, I was a newcomer to the Ford extended family through marriage. It's a great privilege to be here and to think of all of the memories that we celebrate. Of course, when we first talked about this, Susan, I had so hoped that your mother would still be with us in some wonderful fashion. The spirit and the grace and dignity and independence. Some stories which we'll share. And Susan has actually encouraged me to be very honest about some of those Beaver Creek visits. And here we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of this great library and museum and the man whose life it honors. At a time when Europe's economic volatility is sending shockwaves to our markets, when compromise is now a dirty word in politics in Washington. And as both parties are now hurtling forward on the next presidential campaign, what better moment to take a deep breath and think about this singular man and his extraordinary First Lady. When Gerald R. Ford dedicated this library, he said, some of you may well have been here, "As long as the Lord permits, I will continue to advocate closer cooperation among the free nations, a greater sharing of the benefits and burdens of preserving the peace. Yet," he said, "I perceive a revival of isolationism in today's world, spreading like the elusive fruit fly. Under whatever guise, the new isolationism, like the old, represents a futile dream of going it alone." It was so interesting when I think back to Beaver Creek, the fact that President Ford was always surrounded by foreign leaders, and that the focus of the World Economic Forum, which we enjoyed for so many summers, was the economy, but a global economy. He was a visionary in that regard. He foresaw all of the trends, both for good and bad, that were going to become so dominant. And so it was a gathering of economic thinkers and of national security experts, but it really was in the fashion of the president who created the first summit with Giscard d'Estaing and Helmut Schmidt and Prime Minister Callahan and his other dear friends. They, I'm sure, had disagreements, as all allies do, but he so understood the importance of global engagement. He went on to quote at that time of the dedication 30 years ago, his farewell address, his message to Congress, when he said, "To be first in peace, we can never be second in defense." But, President Ford warned, "Military and material strength alone, and this is the surest lesson the past can teach the present, even the awesome might of this great and good land will not prevail if we fail to stand united in purpose and perseverance. If ever freedom fails, it will fall one isolated citadel at a time." Just think back to what President Ford inherited in 1974. Tip O'Neill did, inscribed on the Ford statue, and I encourage any of you who have not been to the Capitol to see this beautiful and graceful and very human statue that was unveiled in the Rotunda last May by Susan and the family and extended family. But inscribed on the Ford statue is a quotation from the former speaker, who said, "God has been good to America, especially during difficult times. At the time of the Civil War, he gave us Abraham Lincoln, and at the time of Watergate, he gave us Gerald Ford. The right man at the right time who was able to put our nation back together again." Speaker Tip O'Neill, think of the contrast with what we experience now among and between our political leaders from different parties. I think we all know where we were on that Friday in August when President Ford put his hand on the Bible and said, "You have not elected me as your president by your ballot, and so I ask you to confirm me as your president with your prayers." He told us that our long national nightmare was over as he strove to restore civility and the rule of law to our government. Decades later, we learned that he reflected on part of that legacy with Bob Woodward, interviews published by agreement posthumously. President Ford told Woodward, "There was a fundamental mistake made back after World War II when the French had committed to support the South Vietnamese." He went on to say, "The point is we were on the wrong side of the locals. We made the same mistake that the French did, except we got deeper and deeper in the war. We could have avoided the whole darn Vietnam War if somebody in the Department of Defense had said, 'Look here, do we want to inherit the French mess?'" Interesting postscript on history. Not something that he would have said openly during his life, but that he was clearly reflecting on for all those decades. Asked what lessons he drew from those mistakes, President Ford went on to tell Woodward, "I've often thought about that, Bob, based on my 30 years in government in very difficult times. We have to assume that we are the most powerful nation in the world militarily, and that we have some obligations on behalf of democracies worldwide. But I don't think we can force democracy on people or a nation that aren't prepared for it." I remember first covering the Republican convention in 1976. I was not based in Washington. I was based in Philadelphia. But the Pennsylvania delegation, and Drew Lewis was leading the delegation, and Ray Schaefer, the governor, were actually very important parts of the coalition that was putting together that nomination. And that was part of the beginning of my love affair with politics. I didn't actually move to Washington until the Jimmy Carter presidency was almost over. So I did not know, as a young reporter, President Ford and Mrs. Ford until after they had left office, years later, when I accompanied my husband to the annual reunions in Washington of the Ford alumni, the officials, the cabinet members, and White House officials. It was extraordinary. I can't think of another presidency that has an annual meeting in June of everyone who was involved. And when you looked around the room and saw the star quality of these figures on domestic and foreign policy, and of course then the World Forum meetings in Beaver Creek. I remember the first time we were invited to stay at the Ford's home. I was completely intimidated. We flew out and we drove up to the home, and I saw the Secret Service agents, and all of a sudden the president came down the steps, and I think we literally got into a tug of war over who was going to carry my suitcase, which he wanted to carry up the steps. And Susan has reminded me of my meltdown moment. There was one visit when you prepare and plan and you pack and you travel and you get there, and we arrived and had the Friday night dinner and then got up on Saturday morning for the first meetings of the forum, and we got to the event itself, and my phone rang, and I got a call from our headquarters in New York, which was that Fidel Castro had tripped and fallen and was in the hospital, and I had the only valid NBC visa to get into Havana. And I was on a payphone in the back of the room, and I could hear the speakers were speaking, and I was missing the whole opening session. And I was saying, we just arrived. I'm in Beaver Creek. I have no way to get to Havana. I have no clothes suitable for Havana. And I made up every excuse I could possibly make, and the head of foreign coverage for NBC said, Andrea, just get on a plane. And I was completely undone, as the story is told in the Ford family. So I got back to the house, and I had just unpacked and hung up my clothes, and everything that I was planning to do that weekend. And Mrs. Ford was at the house, and I had to repack my clothes. NBC was sending a plane to get me to Denver to not waste any more time, and they wanted me to come through Washington, leave a pre-recorded story about Fidel Castro's fall, and then get on the next flight to Miami and then a charter flight into Havana. And it was a total nightmare, a logistical nightmare. And here I was at the home of the former President of the United States, with whom we do not have relations with Cuba, if anyone fails to recognize that minor fact. And I was trying to explain that I had to leave to go to Havana. And I did the only thing that an adult, tough foreign correspondent could do. I broke down in tears. And not the least of which was that I was leaving Alan there to fend for himself, which he was quite able to do, but I didn't really feel like departing as soon as we had arrived for this lovely weekend. And Betty Ford, the former First Lady, said, and she did not know me at all very well then, and she said, let me pack for you. You go talk to Alan. And Betty Ford packed my suitcase to go to Havana, which, for those of you, many of you who know her, who knew her, is so typically kind and comforting and friendly and embracing, which is the woman we remember. Gerald and Betty Ford created such a climate of normalcy in the White House. And I say that with so much admiration. When you think of the pomp and circumstance and security and everything that goes into living in that house and taking on every conceivable responsibility for the security of our great nation, and they did it with such grace and humility and such a sense of duty, and also a sense not only of service, but John Meacham, I read something that he wrote, such a belief in a higher calling and such a religious faith was really so ingrained in both of their beings. I also remember our last visit to Beaver Creek, just before President Ford's 91st birthday. Alan's term as Fed chairman was expiring at midnight on Saturday. We arrived on Friday night. And the issue was the Senate going to confirm him? And if so, was the President of the United States going to sign the document, which he was willing to sign, but was it going to get to him? He was at Camp David. In other words, were we going to have a Fed chairman or an expired former term? So within hours, this was the issue. It was that weekend in August, and the President, as I say, was at Camp David, and we were waiting to find out whether he had signed the legislation. So late Saturday afternoon, word came from the White House that the President had indeed signed it, and it was official. So all that was left was to administer the oath of office. So Alan took the oath of office for the last time, his last term, standing in front of that fieldstone fireplace in the living room at the Ford's home in Beaver Creek on a Saturday night. Dick Cheney administered the oath. I held the Bible. We all toasted Alan with champagne. And it was a moment that, of course, we will never forget. And in fact, largely because the setting could not have been more meaningful. It was President Ford who first gave my husband the opportunity to serve in government, exactly 30 years earlier. The man I got to know in those later years was the man that former Vice President Cheney described in the eulogy at President Ford's service. As he put it, he was not just a cheerful and pleasant man, although these virtues are rare enough at the commanding heights. He was not just a nice guy, the next-door neighbor whose luck landed him at the White House. It was this man, Gerald R. Ford, who led our public safely through a crisis that could have turned to catastrophe. We will never know what further unravelings, what greater malevolence might have come in that time of furies turned loose and hearts turned cold. But we do know this: America was spared the worst, and this was the doing of an American president. For all the grief that never came, for all the wounds that were never inflicted, the people of the United States will forever stand in debt to the good man and faithful servant that we mourn. A word about the pardon. At the time, President Ford was, as we all know, excoriated for it. It surely cost him the election. I remember one night, sitting around that table in Beaver Creek, and President Ford spoke of how much it meant to him that Teddy Kennedy and Caroline Kennedy had awarded him that year the Profile in Courage Award for that very act of the presidential pardon, because it signified an understanding of the need to move past the furies. And also, as Dick Cheney said, it is far from the worst fate that a man should be remembered for his capacity to forgive. Just think, as I was going through some of these papers and collecting my memories, think of the contrast with our combative politics now. What would Gerald Ford, a man of the House, have said about the deliberate and accidental miscommunication of this summer's debt ceiling crisis between the White House and both houses of Congress? I remember the last dinner in the Rotunda when President and Mrs. Ford came to Washington, and there was a birthday dinner, and it was quite a beautiful evening. And we all knew that President Ford's great ambition was to be Speaker of the House, not President of the United States. He so loved the House. And when you think about that period, the polling data show that second only to 9/11 was the decline in public confidence and in public respect for government, and in the sense that the country was headed in the wrong direction. Second only to 9/11. Of all the crises we've experienced, Katrina and others, this August debt ceiling crisis elicited such a decline in public confidence, which the President alluded to this today in his news conference, which was a very combative and political moment as well, as was the Speaker's preemptive speech at a conference at the museum about a half hour earlier. So neither side is resting, and in fact, I think the weapons are armed and aimed and locked and loaded, if you will, as we head into this election cycle. But that August crisis, 6 weeks, whatever it was, it felt as though it were endless, was one of the most dispiriting periods that I've ever covered in Washington. And I've covered a lot of bad political moments, reminded of which is tomorrow is the 20th anniversary of the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings. And if I weren't here, there was a gathering at Georgetown University Law School that I had been asked to cover tonight for a possible story that we might be doing tomorrow, because I did cover those hearings. And I remember it was before the days of cable news in our network. CNN was on the air, but we were on the broadcast network. So for us to go nonstop with coverage during those hearings meant that we were canceling commercials right and left. That's real money. And Saturday night at midnight, Tom Brokaw was anchoring, and I was in the Russell Caucus room where the hearings had been held. At midnight, we signed off the air, and until we got back on with Meet the Press the next day. And when we think about all of the characters involved, with Strom Thurmond, and Joe Biden was chairing it, and Arlen Specter, of course, got into some difficulty with the women voters of Pennsylvania over the way he was questioning Anita Hill, bailed out in his election the next year only by the fact that Teresa Hines, newly widowed from the other Pennsylvania Senator, Jack Hines, was a great friend of ours, that Teresa did a TV commercial which helped Specter get reelected because he had such a problem after that poisonous hearing from both sides. Teddy Kennedy, I mean, just think of who distinguished himself or herself in that whole process. And when I think back, as I've had to, because I may be writing about this tomorrow, that was really the beginning of an extraordinarily vicious, and, I mean, the Bork hearings were rough, but those hearings were so explicitly rough. I remember my husband was at an IMF World Bank gathering in Bangkok that weekend, and he kept calling and wondering where I was, and I was live on television all weekend, which is not what we used to do. And when I finally reached him with the time difference and all, I said, I can't even describe what this has been like in terms of gender politics. Ruth Marcus of the Washington Post wrote a somewhat whimsical, a little bit whimsical column yesterday in the Washington Post about all of it, because she feels that some of the scandalous hearings and investigations and, in fact, impeachment that followed, I think about some of the sexual investigations and the ethics committees and an expulsion from Congress and the rest, could never have happened in the 90s had that hearing not taken place on national television. It just exposed us to a completely different vocabulary, political vocabulary, and other vocabulary. But so just thinking back of some of the really corrosive things that have happened, and I think that we in the media, I say this freely, play a role in all of that. When I was first sent to cover Congress full-time after 8 years covering Ronald Reagan, I remember Tom Pettit, our late, great Senate correspondent, who used to call me Sis, and I had thought at the time that I was going to end up being the White House correspondent covering George Herbert Walker Bush. And instead, they sent me to Kennebunkport in 1988 for Thanksgiving weekend, and I said, why do I have to go? I seem to always be whining, but for someone who spent weekends in planes, Christmas and other holidays in planes as the sort of backup correspondent, and then ended up for 8 years, and it was not hard duty in Santa Barbara, I can guarantee you, but we did spend a lot of time away from home. And so now, 1988, the election's over, and I'm told I have to go to Kennebunkport for Thanksgiving, and I can tell you that the Bushes were not happy, nor was anyone else in Kennebunkport, that the White House press corps was about to invade. And it's a very small town to absorb you can remember the first trip to Vail, I think, and what it was like trying to organize that mayhem. So I said, well, why am I going? They said, well, you're going to be the White House correspondent. This is part of your duties. And I got up there, and I've written about this, so it's not too terribly awful to divulge. But on Thanksgiving Day, I started writing my story and called New York to get my script approved. And the executive producer of the Nightly News said, and as soon as you get recorded, your voice, call me back and we'll talk about your new assignment. And I said, what new assignment? And he said, oh my God, they haven't told you. And it was that I was going to go to Congress. So I immediately called Tom Pettit and said, I'm not going to be the White House correspondent. I'm going to cover Congress. And he said, sis, you have died and gone to heaven. This is going to be your favorite beat. And I've now traveled the world with so many secretaries of state. I've been at the State Department since 1994. I covered all of the 92 campaign and the beginning of the Clinton years. And I can tell you, honestly, I really understood your father, Susan, because I have never loved a beat as much as I loved covering Congress. It was so exciting, and people want to talk. And you're not, it's a reporter's dream. But when I arrived, it was right at the time that talk radio and later cable TV was becoming very, very vocal. One of the big issues initially was the congressional pay raise. And everyone was going at each other, and the Nader people were all arguing that Congress didn't deserve a raise, and the talk radio hosts. And it's very quaint when you think back to talk radio hosts, but it really has become a different velocity of information as we've now gone into 24/7 cable coverage of everything. And there were so many scandals. It was the Keating Five, and if anyone remembers the housing scandal, and Sam Pierce, the housing secretary. I mean, there was just one thing after another. There were fights over civil rights law, the civil rights law being reenacted, and of course gun control and the Brady Bill. And it was just a very, very difficult time, really culminating in 1991 in the Clarence Thomas hearings. And I don't think we've ever gone back. And now our politics have become, as money has just flooded the zone, and as the news media has changed into more opinion in many aspects, not on broadcast television news, but certainly in cable. That is the coin of the realm, is opinion and argument, and it has just become increasingly combative. And I just wonder how we can have serious, important debates about what to do about our budget deficit and what to do about the disparity between rich and poor growing wider all the time, which some have argued is a real crisis of national security. What kind of education system are we really going to have in this country? How can we be falling so far behind Finland and Singapore and Hong Kong and other places in terms of the scores and achievement scores in math and reading? And what are we going to do about it? It's something that we at NBC and MSNBC have focused on very intensively in our Education Nation summits each year. And I think this year we really did strive to look for solutions, not just for scapegoats or villains. So we really are trying to spark a national debate about major issues, just as people do here in this library. Oh, by the way, the truly impressive thing about this institution is how expert the archivists are. I'll let Susan later share with you some of the things they found that she had mentioned. But they produced all of my husband's letters and the Council on Economic Advisors documents and a CD with pictures, which I'm sure will show a wide assortment of plaid pants. I should add one other thing for all of you who have been so kind to come here tonight. I just want to say that for those of you who are fans of baseball, I was born in the Bronx. I know. Not only was I born in the Bronx, but I was supposed to be Andrew, not Andrea. This was a big mistake. From the age of 2, I was taken to Yankee Stadium. From the age of 3, my father had somehow found a glove. And he would, as we were kids, he has these 2 daughters, eventually he did thankfully have a son, but he would teach us how to wrap our gloves and oil our gloves and put a ball in the glove so that we'd have a really, good pouch. And then we would take our gloves to the stadium and hope to catch a fly ball. So there was a game, I understand, underway. Now, I just wanted to say a word about Betty Ford, a word more about this incredibly independent, irrepressible, and honest and direct woman. I don't know if you've seen the PBS documentary. It's wonderful, and see it if you haven't already. When you think about how extraordinary she was, given the politics of the day, it becomes even more startling and wonderful. When I attended that service in California, I heard her eulogized as a wife and a mother and a role model for all women. And I remembered her as a young reporter when I went to cover the women's rights movement. And because of her support for the ERA, she was an icon with unlikely partners, Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem and others in the march. And so many kindnesses, as I say, that she extended to me and to my husband in the decades since. And by the way, I also have a cherished memory of President Ford. I went, only a few months before he passed, I went to visit my friend Lee Annenberg. We were great friends from the University of Pennsylvania, where we both were trustees. And I went to visit her, and she decided to invite, as a surprise, President Ford for lunch. Your mother was not feeling that well, so she didn't come. Carol Price, another old friend, came. And so Lee Annenberg and Carol Price and your father and I had lunch, and it was just wonderful. And he was just fine with having lunch with all of us and listening to the girl chat. But speaking of the millions of American women who have a debt to Betty Ford, if this is not too personal, in September of 1974, as you all know, she showed by example that women did not have to hide the fact of their breast cancer. And this was revolutionary. She used that experience, and you can see it in that film, to demystify and destigmatize it. And in that documentary that PBS made a few years ago, there's an extraordinary scene at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Mrs. Ford is recuperating from surgery. She's in her bathrobe in her hospital bed, and they have a photo opportunity. And the president is visiting her, embracing her for the television cameras. That joint appearance said more to the women and to the men of this country about the way to handle this disease than anything else could possibly have. Years later, women like me, we grew of age. We underwent our first screenings for breast cancer at the Betty Ford mammography centers. Ours in Washington was at Columbia Hospital for Women. They were all over the country. Well, a month ago, my screening showed that I, too, had an early-stage tumor, and I underwent surgery with a very good prognosis. And I know that we would not have made the progress that we have made over these decades to treat this disease if not for the leadership of Betty Ford and Susan Ford carrying that on with Susan G. Komen and all of the other groups. So for me, this is indeed very, very personal. Together, the Fords remind us, even in the aftermath of Watergate's poisonous atmosphere, that there was a gentler time in politics, when character mattered. President Ford and Mrs. Ford are now remembered for sincerity and serenity, for decency, for healing. And this library, this museum, will explain why for generations to come. And in fact, we need those lessons now more than ever. Thank you all so very much. And I look forward to your questions on any subjects at all.
We already have some wonderful questions in, and we'll start with these, and I sense that more are coming. First one, is it because of the airplane that Washington is out of touch with the people?
I don't think it's the airplane. There is a sense that with all of our communications, and we should think about the extraordinary genius of Steve Jobs and the way our lives have changed. So we're in instantaneous communication with each other, but I don't think we get out enough. When I think about presidential campaigns, by the way, the airplane used to take us from airport to airport, and this was the paradigm of covering a campaign. There were buses in between, but basically we were doing airport rallies. And the most interesting campaign that I ever covered was 1992 with the Clinton-Gore bus trips, because they were completely ad hoc. There was a notional schedule, but having a schedule with Bill Clinton as the speaker was foolishness. But the bottom line is we got all over the Midwest, and we traveled the country on that bus. When we left Madison Square Garden at the end of the convention in 1992, and we were on the road, and when I think now how primitive our phones were and our communications, and that we had a Winnebago for NBC with a big editing bay of tape equipment, and we would have walkie-talkies, and I would be on the bus with the walkie-talkie telling my producer, take a look at the fourth scene on such and such videotape that we just shot as he gave, a speech at a crossing. And she would screen it, and then at some point I would get off the bus, the press bus, and get in the Winnebago, and how unsafe it was. We had folding chairs. This was not retrofitted for television. So we would be going on the highway sort of like this, trying to keep the chair from falling over and hoping that the computers would work, which were dial-ups. And you can only imagine trying to get our scripts to New York and then dropping off in some parking lot somewhere while the bus would go on, getting nightly news done. We would drop off around 5:30 to get it done, finish at 6:30, and then drive like hell to catch up. But which wasn't hard because Bill Clinton was still giving a speech somewhere. And I remember one night in Iowa when I thought Al Gore was just going to, finally Al Gore left the rally and went to bed. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and we all had to get up early the next morning. So that's what the campaigns were like, which is just to say it's so rare that you get out and do what David Broder, another great loss this year, was losing David Broder, the dean of our press corps. He would door knock. David Broder never got trapped. In fact, he spent a lot of time in the Upper Peninsula. He was a real Michigan vacationer. And he would go door to door and get out of the bubble. And that's the way we used to cover things. I think it's not the airplane so much as I now have a program every day at 1 o'clock. And so if I'm going to take the show on the road, which we're going to be doing through the campaign, it's a big deal. And we have to figure out how to do it and from where to do it. And so I don't get out as much as I would actually like to. And a lot of us are tied down by the exigencies of news deadlines and having to be on camera all the time. Whereas, and it's also the same with the way we cover Congress. Before C-SPAN, yes, there was a time before C-SPAN. Before the Senate floor, the House floor, in my recollection, was for many years in the 80s carried. But before the Senate floor was on television, as the Senate correspondent, I would have a courtroom artist, and we would sit in the gallery, and I'd watch the debate and tell the artist, as we would cover a courtroom, which senators to depict and how to draw them. And that would be our evening news pictures. Well, once it was on television, the correspondents started sitting in their cubicles in the press office, not in the gallery off the floor, watching it all on television. And you don't get the same dynamic as watching, because of course the C-SPAN cameras are single focus. You don't see those sidebar conversations and see who's putting the arm on who, and I mean, you just don't get the flavor of it. The other thing by watching it on television and having computers where New York is constantly saying, what about this, and you get these constant messages, top screen messages, to check this out, check that out. What I loved about Congress was wandering the halls and snagging people as they came off the floor, either in the Speaker's lobby or right off the Senate floor. And we now are sort of wed to this television image or the computer screen rather than wandering around. And that's sort of the, I guess, the symbol of what has happened. We're not getting out enough in America outside of Washington. And that's one of the real problems that I think we have to address.
We have some fabulous questions, and it will stay for hours.
No, we won't do that to you.
Forget the game, ladies and gentlemen.
There is baseball.
Although we did think about it. The staff did discuss broadcasting it silently as a backdrop for her talk, but out of respect for our visitors, we didn't do that. We have lots of good questions. The next one, what can we do to diminish the divisive atmosphere in today's politics?
Well, I think we all have to be much more engaged. I think we have to let our elected officials know when we don't like what they are doing. And I mean to really let them know by emails and calls, and we have to vote. We have to care. The lack of engagement by informed citizens is the worst indictment of our politics. And it's very easy to be apathetic or angry or turned off and tuned out. But, and the other thing is you have to demand more of us. Our reporting and our coverage has to be more contextualized, deeper, more analytical, and more comprehensive. And that I think is a very important component.
Since you just put the onus on you as well as all of us, there are a couple of questions. Could you name one interview that you wished you had or that you missed, and what was your favorite story to cover?
I'll tell you an embarrassing thing about a Fidel Castro interview, because I did go down often during the years before there was a crackdown on dissidents, and that created an obvious problem in getting any sort of communication down there. But there was a period, especially during the crisis over Elian Gonzalez, when I went down often, and Fidel Castro, I mean, it was an experience, because you would get invited to come over to the palace with your team, and it was midnight, and he would sit down to dinner, and maybe at 2 o'clock in the morning he would decide, well, okay, I'll do the interview. And I remember one interview, we were doing a documentary down there, and I asked him the opening question. It was maybe 1 in the morning. 45 minutes later, he was still answering. And this is through translation. And it's said by one of the cameramen that I dozed off. I very much enjoyed sparring with Maggie Thatcher. I loved covering the Reagan-Gorbachev summits. Reykjavik was fascinating. The Geneva summit, the first one, the choreography of all of that, and the way, one of Reagan's first big arms control speech was at Eureka College. And then the follow-up, and I remember when we used to ask him why didn't he meet with Chernenko and Andropov and first with Brezhnev, and he said, well, they all keep dying on me. So he had a point. So finally, there was this adversary, Gorbachev, who was a man in his 50s and was prepared with a lot of tension within the foreign policy team and a huge involvement by the First Lady in terms of the importance of having that summit in Geneva. And you may recall that there was, Don Regan was the chief of staff, and that was all a very interesting episode. If you think First Ladies are not important, they are very, very important as judges of character and personnel and have a lot to say about what happens in the White House, whether it's apparent or not. But I just loved arms control because the stakes were so high. It's hard to explain to some of the young reporters and interns and students now, but the Cold War was a very serious business, and so nothing could have been more important than the fact that President Reagan was meeting for the first time with the Soviet leader, and there was so much at stake. So I just found that all very, very interesting.
Following up on the foreign policy line, 1% of the revenue is spent on foreign aid. Both parties want drastic cuts. How will this affect foreign policy and world events?
I think it's a devastating notion that we can balance the budget by eliminating the 1%. Hillary Clinton has tried very hard to advocate for what she calls smart power, which is the civilian side of the military. And it's a lot cheaper than the military. And for all that they have tried to do in Iraq and in Afghanistan to now be cutting that budget. Now, I'm not suggesting that it's all been well spent or that the extraordinary amount of money that we're spending on security so that our AID officers and civilian State Department employees can go out in the field and work in these regions. This is very, very risky business, and we've suffered some tremendous losses. But to lower our profile in the world at the very time when many of our economic competitors, principally China, are everywhere, all over Latin America, all over South America and Africa, investing, buying, engaging, opening consulates and embassies. And for us to be reducing our footprint, to me, seems like a very foolish economy, because that 1% of our budget is not going to fix the trillions that we need to deal with.
Great. Let's talk about the current presidential field. We've got 3 questions. I'll group them for convenience here. Do you think that the Wall Street occupiers will cancel out the Tea Party? A second one related, is there any rethinking going on at MSNBC over the fact that Michelle Bachmann was an unknown member of Congress until Chris Matthews put her on his program? And finally, what do you think of the current GOP presidential field? Now, those are just 3 small questions, ladies and gentlemen. You can choose among them, actually.
I'm not going to give an opinion of the field, except to say that I think it is now what it is, that after Sarah Palin's very easily forecastable decision, since she had not done anything to create an organization that could have competed in these primaries, she has the money and access to the money, but not any of the field workers that she would have needed. So it was not a surprise that she is not running. But I think that and certainly Governor Christie's decision, given the shortness of time, and boy, when we look at the calendar now, it looks as though we very well may be spending Christmas Eve in Des Moines, because Bill Gardner, the Republican Secretary of State in New Hampshire, is deadly serious about the fact that this Nevada move for a Saturday caucus there is going to shorten the 1 week that they constitutionally insist between Iowa and New Hampshire. And if that's the case, it's going to all push back. And so instead of Iowa being January 5th, and us, it's all about us, of course, spending another New Year's Eve in Iowa, it's going to be backed up into December. And it just means that there's just very little time left for the candidates to organize themselves. Herman Cain is an interesting, straight-talking business guy who I don't think is going to be the Republican nominee. And I don't think that when we get through the debates and we get into actual voting that New Hampshire and Iowa voters are going to decide that he has the experience to be the commander-in-chief. That would just be an analysis. I think he's a very interesting character. He's actually going to be on MSNBC with Lawrence O'Donnell tonight at this hour. But I think we're looking at Mitt Romney and Rick Perry. And I would not discount Rick Perry because of his access to money. And if he can, as his wife Anita said, get better prepared for this next debate. This debate will be a Bloomberg Washington Post debate on October 11th in Hanover, New Hampshire, one of my favorite places where my parents live. And I think it's going to be a very, very important test. I don't think that it's the final test for Rick Perry, but I think if he does badly in this debate next Tuesday, that it is then Mitt Romney's to lose. But I think that he has the money. He just raised $17 million, and he's got $15 million in the bank, so his spend rate is very, very low. And so Rick Perry is going to be funded into the primaries and able to compete. Mitt Romney has waged a very smart, well-organized campaign. He's going to give a foreign policy speech tomorrow. I interviewed Rich Williamson, a veteran of the Reagan and Bush White Houses, and one of his new foreign policy advisors, as is Michael Chertoff, and also Mike Hayden, the former CIA director and NSA director. And I think his foreign policy speech tomorrow is going to try to reconcile some of the quirks that some critics have suggested with his answers in previous debates. On June 13th in New Hampshire, he suggested that we needed to withdraw from Afghanistan but listen to the generals on the ground, and he's been sort of wrestling with how to redefine that. When I asked Williamson about that today on the air, he said that he thought that that Mitt Romney thinks that President Obama is withdrawing from Afghanistan too precipitously. So I think that aside from the economy, which is going to be the main focus of the Bloomberg debate for obvious reasons of their market share and their audience, I think that on foreign policy terms, Romney still has to define what he means and has to explain what he means about immigration, because he has taken some positions on immigration that are not really consistent with his economic background. So all of the candidates, and I'm just now talking about the Republicans because I don't see a challenger to President Obama. I think President Obama's main problem is going to be, is he going to run back to the center? Is he going to try to please his more progressive base? Which focus is he going to have as he heads into this campaign? And partly it will depend on whom he's running against.
Let's go back in history. You talked a little bit about President Obama just now. How would you describe President Ford's leadership style?
I think you probably inferred from what I said earlier. I think that President Ford was consistent and studious and visionary in the way he viewed foreign policy, and inclusive and collegial in the way he viewed domestic policy, because he came of age when Democrats and Republicans played golf together and had a drink together and socialized, and their children knew each other, and it was a different Washington. People were more likely to move their families to Washington, educate their kids there, join the clubs, spouses knew each other and were friends. It's the Washington that we remember rather fondly. And frankly, there was a lot less money in politics. And when you've got so much drive, I remember a Meet the Press back in, I think, 92, when I was interviewing David Boren, who went home to become, the university president. And I asked him why he was quitting. That was a year when a lot of very special people retired from the Senate. And he said, this drive to raise money, I have to raise millions of dollars in 6 years, and the minute you get elected, you're starting to raise money again. And now that has just grown exponentially, so that people don't have time to get off an airplane and be with constituents other than those who are paying for the privilege of wining and dining with their member or their senator. And I just think it has distorted the process to an extraordinary degree.
In today's environment where news has become entertainment, what advice do you have for aspiring broadcast journalists?
I would like to say become an English professor, but I do believe very strongly that those who aspire to be broadcast journalists should focus on the journalism more than on the broadcasting, should be in school not to study tape editing or electronic graphics, but should be reading deeply in economics and political science and history and literature and religion and sociology and anything else that is intriguing. I just believe in a very broadly based education. I'm a trustee at the University of Pennsylvania. I have a bias toward a liberal arts education, but I know the value, obviously, of other types of education, but I think that we become vocational too soon. And when we have interns, and they're wonderful at NBC, I just advise them to take their time to read and to write. Writing is the most undervalued talent. The people I admire so greatly in my profession are Tom Brokaw and Brian Williams, both superb writers, and David Brinkley, my mentor, Jack Chancellor, the people who really knew how to write for television. We had Tom Pettit and Doug Kiker, some of the great reporters who covered President Ford, and John Cochran and others from those White House years were really fine writers, and John Palmer. But many of the younger correspondents don't really understand the importance of capturing that moment in words that are descriptive but not too descriptive, letting the picture tell the story, but also, aside from writing, just learning the fundamentals of journalism. And that can only come from experience and from understanding politics and understanding American history.
We have some personal questions here. How did you meet Gerald Greenspan? And what's a day like with Gerald Greenspan? And I heard the story you shared with us over our little supper about his commercial.
Well, one of the things is that he's a complete techie. Who knew? And that when he left the Ford White House and went back to Wall Street, to his firm, to his economic consulting firm, one of the things he did once was to make a commercial. And it was for, I think, an Apple II. He actually did a commercial for Apple. And it's very funny. I saw it back in 1984. It's actually on YouTube. And it's a very, it captures his wry sense of humor. What's a date like? It usually involves conversation, a lot of conversation about music, because he's a former musician and I was an aspiring musician before I became a journalist, and baseball. Baseball is a very big part of our lives. and we both came from New York. We rooted for different teams, so there's that. We love music, and we love politics in the broadest sense, not combative politics, but just political conversation. It doesn't involve a whole lot of economics because I am dismally unprepared for that. But as those of you who know him know, he is amazingly kind and funny and sweet, and we love to play tennis. And so a typical day is me getting up for the Today Show as I did this morning at 5 or 5:30, and my husband getting up to make me coffee, and then he hits the treadmill, and then he starts work on a book that he's writing now and goes into his office and collects data, which he loves to do. And neither of us ever get home before 8 or later at night, so it's generally not enough sleep, but a lot of fun.
Well, then you'll understand the next question. How do you find balance in your life? You seem to be everywhere all the time.
I don't find balance. Oh, you asked how we met. We met over David Stockman's budget. It was very romantic. I kept peppering people in the Reagan White House with questions about whether the budget, especially after David Stockman confided to Jim Fallows, I think in the Atlantic, about the budget numbers. And if you remember, he was woodshedded, but he was not fired as budget director. So I kept asking a lot of questions about the budget. And finally, of all people, David Gergen in the White House said, "Why don't you ask a real economist?" And he said, "Why don't you call an old friend of mine from the Ford White House, Gerald Greenspan?" And I did not know Alan at all, so I called New York and kept asking him questions. This was in the early 80s. So we talked on the phone a lot about budget numbers and forecasts. And eventually I was in New York doing a Today Show story, and so we went out for dinner and discovered that we really liked each other a lot, beyond David Stockman's budget.
Great. We're going to end with 3 questions. First one, we have someone in this audience who's from the Bronx, and this person wants to know, where are you from in the Bronx?
Pelham Parkway, and a beautiful part of the Bronx. And this was in the day when we also had the Giants playing at the Polo Grounds. Later, the Mets played at the Polo Grounds before Shea Stadium, but of course Shea Stadium is now no more. So, I mean, baseball goes all the way back. And all during the 1950s. By then we had moved to Westchester County, to the suburbs, and all during the 50s there were the great World Series between the Dodgers and the Yankees. And my husband, having been a Dodgers fan, so we have different memories of the 50s. Not only are we different generations, but different baseball memories.
Following up on the Yankees, who is your all-time favorite Yankee?
There was only one Mickey Mantle. I love Yogi Berra, whom I've met, which is fantastic. But Mickey Mantle, in that whole Mantle-Maris summer, I was always a Mantle person. He just was a huge hero to me, and I know he had a very troubled life, but I didn't know that then. I was just a kid. But
Great.
Mickey Mantle.
2 more. Did you ever catch a fly ball at the Yankees?
No, I didn't. My dad once had a Babe Ruth home run from the bleachers, but unfortunately he gave it to a young cousin who it disappeared in family lore. So, no, I never caught a ball. Not yet, at least.
And finally, some astute person in this audience wants to know what you're expecting, I'm sure, Tigers or Yankees?
I dare not say, or I'll never get out with it. May the best team win.
Thank you so much. Pens with his signature. It is our honor to present Andrea Mitchell with a pair of ballpoint pens with the signature of our favorite president, Gerald R. Ford. We thank you so much for coming. This is wonderful.
Well, thank all of you. This has been such a privilege, and I will treasure this. Thank you, Susan.
And thanks also to Susan Ford Bales for her influence in bringing Andrea here. We are just delighted to have this as our anniversary program. Before we close, I want to alert you that we're having an anniversary this year, not only here in Ann Arbor, but at the museum in Grand Rapids. For those of you who are so inclined, on Sunday afternoon, October 30th, please join us in Grand Rapids where we're hosting Secretary James Baker. 3 p.m., it's an easy drive. We'd love to have you come and join us. Coming up here, we're having the Consul General of Canada, Roy Norton, speaking on November 7th. He'll be talking about 235 years of Canadian-U.S. relations, and if you are from this area and interested in whether we're going to build a new international river crossing, you might want to come to that program. We're also having a film premiere here. There's a new film coming out about Senator Arthur Vandenberg. It's being done by one of our trustees, Hank Meyer, who's also writing a book on Arthur Vandenberg, and it's being the producer, Mike Grass, will be here. They'll be showing highlights of the film and talking about the research and the process, and we will be serving popcorn. And looking ahead to 2012, today at the library, we had a researcher in who's the producer of a new film about President Ford and how he stood up for a fellow U of M teammate, Willis Ward, when Georgia Tech refused to play Michigan if Ward, who is black, took the field. The title of the film is Black and Blue, and this is a program that every U of M fan will not want to miss. So we don't have it scheduled yet, but that will be in the early winter. So thank you again to Andrea Mitchell and Susan Ford Bales for being here, and enjoy the reception.